So the muscular system, there are 639 named muscles in the body, and it's made up of 6 trillion different muscle fibers. Each individual muscle fiber can support up to 1,000 times its own weight. So that's a lot of weight. Our muscles are very strong in nature if you consider them relative to their size. To give you a definition of muscle fiber, a muscle fiber just means the same thing as a muscle cell. So each individual muscle fiber is the same as an individual muscle cell. Those terms are used interchangeably throughout this lecture and for our lectures in the future. So just keep in mind that that's simply a muscle fiber is the same thing as what a muscle cell would be. So again, muscles make up nearly half of the body mass. And again, like we said, muscle fibers are the same thing as our muscle cells. We have various types of muscle fibers, and we'll talk about the fiber types here a little bit later in this lecture. Four major functions of the muscle tissue. First would be movement. So muscles are going to allow us to obviously have movement, not only movement of the body, but also movement within the body itself. So I guess most commonly we think of movement in terms of moving our body. So being able to move your arms, move your legs to run or walk or do any of the activities that we normally do. But this also includes movement of food within your system. So the contraction of smooth muscle within the digestive tract will allow us to move food through that particular system. Also, we have smooth muscle within the cardiovascular system, and we also have cardiac muscle, and that is going to allow us to have movement of blood throughout the cardiovascular system. So movement is really, I guess, a three-pronged definition here. Okay. Another function of muscle is maintenance of posture. So we have several muscles, particularly located in your back, that are contracting kind of all the time, allowing us to maintain an upright position. And these muscles have a high amount of endurance, and they're what allows us to constantly be able to maintain our normal body posture. Function number 3 of a muscle would be joint stability. So as I mentioned in lecture 3 when we were talking about the skeletal system and the joints of the body, a muscle generally needs to cross a joint in order to allow for a muscle action to occur. So a muscle will attach to one bone and then have its attachment on a different bone and therefore cross a joint. The crossing of a joint will provide us with some amount of joint stability. Again, the amount of stability provided by muscles can vary from joint to joint. For example, the hip has probably, I want to say, 12 different muscles that are going to cross the hip joint. And so you can imagine the amount of stability that's provided by those muscles just based on the pure mass, the pure amount of muscle that we have. That will play a really important role for us in terms of maintaining hip stability of that particular joint. Our fourth function of the muscle is heat generation. So every time we utilize energy, and we'll talk about metabolism actually in the second semester of this class. But anytime we break down energy, we are releasing about half of it in the form of heat. So our muscles actually require a large amount of energy, and therefore they generate about 80% of the heat that we have within our bodies. So again, the 4 functions to review would be number 1, movement, number 2, maintenance of posture, number 3, joint stability, and number 4, heat generation. There are also 4 unique characteristics of the muscle itself. Contractility is one. So the muscles shorten, and as they shorten, they generate a strong pulling force. and this pulling force allows them to really contract in nature. So as muscles shorten, this is what we know as the contraction of the muscle. So they're contractile units. Number two, they're excitable. So nerve signals can stimulate the cells to contract. We know this to be true because we need to have communication from the nervous system. It can also be from the endocrine system as well. Generally from the nervous system, though, is going to provide us with the information we need in order to know which muscles to contract when, and how quick should we do it, and how powerfully should we do this. So the nervous system can provide us with information that allows the muscles to be excitable. So we can control basically when they contract. Number three is extensibility. So the tissue can be stretched by the contraction of an opposing muscle. So these tissues need to be able to stretch, and again, I guess kind of the beauty of this, or kind of the benefit of having extensible types of tissue, is that this allows us to have such a great range of motion. And this can allow us to do a greater variety of activities and joint movements because the tissues on all sides of the joint are going to be able to be stretched and easily extensible in nature. Number four, elasticity. So after being stretched, the muscle can recoil passively to resume its original resting length. So we have three different types of muscle tissue, as I've kind of alluded to, and we talked about this in the tissues lecture already. But we have smooth muscle, which is spindle-shaped, non-striated in nature, so under a microscope you can't see the striped appearance. It's also uninucleated, so each cell has one nuclei, so uni means one nuclei. And where is this located? It occurs on the walls of the internal organs. So for example, within the digestive tract, also within some of our arteries as well. And another unique characteristic regarding smooth muscle is it's involuntary in nature. So you don't need to have any type of neural stimuli or consciously think about having this smooth muscle contract. It can kind of do it on its own. Cardiac muscle is striated in nature, so under a microscope we can see the striped appearance of the muscle tissue. Also uninucleated, so there is one single nuclei per cell. And where is it located? It's located in the walls of the heart, and also involuntary in nature. So again, we don't necessarily think about having the contraction of our heart, it just happens on its own. Skeletal muscle, which is where we'll focus most of our time in this lecture, is striated in nature. So you can see the striped appearance under a microscope, and it's tubular. So each of the cells itself are kind of like a cylinder in nature. They're round and neatly organized next to each other. Multinucleated. So each cell of the skeletal muscle has more than one nuclei, and they're usually attached to the skeleton and voluntary in nature. So it's going to require some sort of neural signaling or some sort of excitable message that will allow our skeletal muscle to contract. Again, here it just gives you a nice summary of those three types of muscle tissue and kind of what each individual cell looks like. So again, you can see the smooth muscle cell is kind of a spindle-shaped cell. Our skeletal muscle cells are more cylinder-like in nature, cylindrical in nature. And then the cardiac muscle tissue is branched in nature. Okay, so again, just to give you more details, I basically wanted you to have a better look at what this would look like under a microscope. So here again, you can see a histological slide of our cardiac muscle. Involuntary, again, like we said, we don't necessarily think about having the contraction of our cardiac muscle. It just happens. Branching. So you can see here, this is pretty cool. the branching layers of the cells. And I want you to think about the way the heart is shaped. It's kind of like I don't know, like a chamber, like an oval chamber, you could say, like a balloon almost. And why it would be important for the tissue to be branched in nature. So if you think about what our skeletal muscle looks like, and again, we'll get to this in another slide or two, the skeletal muscle is very neatly organized and everything goes in a nice little row. When our skeletal muscle contracts, it shortens. Okay, so we're going to have the shortening of the entire muscle together in unison in order for the skeletal muscle to contract. With cardiac muscle, however, the fibers are branched in nature, you can see, and so everything's kind of intertwined and intermingled and not necessarily in a nice, neat order. And the reason for this, again, if you think about the shape of the heart, is we don't need to just shorten the muscle fibers, we need to squeeze that whole chamber together in order for us to move blood. So the reason that it's branched is it allows us to contract not in a shortening way, but in a squeezing way so that we can get that blood to be expelled from the heart with greater ease. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail once we get to our cardiac unit. This is just kind of an introductory for you in terms of the different types of muscle tissue. Also contains intercollectated discs, and these discs are kind of a specialized junction between the muscle cells, and there's a special, within these discs themselves, this allows us to more easily communicate among the cells. And again, the idea with this is that it's going to allow the cardiac muscle to contract in unison and create kind of the squeezing force as opposed to a shortening force. Okay. In terms of smooth muscle, again, we said it's found in the walls of internal organs that are other than the heart. It's non-striated in nature, and again, basically that just means that we can't see the protein filaments that are located within the smooth muscle. It's involuntary in nature. Again, we don't necessarily think about the contraction of the smooth muscle. It just kind of happens on its own. It's uninucleated. So again, each cell has one single nuclei, and it's a falciform type of arrangement. Again, that just means that it's spindle-shaped in nature. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, again, we'll discuss in much greater detail in our future lectures. In the digestive lecture, we'll talk more detail about the smooth muscle, and the cardiovascular system, again, we'll talk in more detail about the cardiac muscle. So from here on forward, with this lecture, we're going to focus on that of skeletal muscle. Okay. Again, skeletal muscle makes up 40% of our body weight. That's a significant amount of our weight. I love this slide. It just looks so organized and nice and neat, which is, unique, I guess, in terms of the arrangement of the skeletal muscle. Again, the cells have many nuclei, or they're multinucleated, and they're striated in appearance. And when we say they're striated in appearance, they look striped, and the reason for that is the relationship between the protein filaments located within the skeletal muscle. Okay. So in addition to skeletal muscle tissue, muscle contains connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerves. Again, this is, I guess, similar to that of many other tissues. With the skeletal system, like we talked about, we had a connective tissue lining. We also had an artery and a vein that ran through the Haversian system, and then we also had nerves located within this. So this is nothing new in terms of the different types of tissues that we have within the body. We're going to both discuss the muscle in terms of gross anatomy and also microscopic anatomy. So with gross anatomy, again, we're talking about the appearance with the naked eye, and with microscopic anatomy, we're talking about the histological appearance, so what things would look like magnified under a microscope. So some of the basic features of the skeletal muscle that we want to define, we have an epimysium, which you can see here. Epi means upon, mysium means muscle, and this is a connective tissue layer that surrounds the entire muscle, so it surrounds the outside of the muscle. We also have a perimysium. Peri means around, and the perimysium is going to surround bundles of muscle fibers or fascicles. Okay, so a fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells, basically, or muscle fibers, whichever you prefer. And the perimysium is the connective tissue that surrounds this. We also have an endomysium. Endo means within. Endomysium is actually the connective tissue lining that surrounds each individual muscle cell itself. Okay, so connective tissue lining, we have 3 of them. We have an epimysium, which surrounds the entire muscle, perimysium, which surrounds a group of muscle cells or a muscle fascicle, and endomysium, which is the connective tissue lining that covers each individual muscle cells. We also have a tendon, and the tendon is the connection between the bone and the muscle, and the tendon is created when the epimysium comes together to connect the muscle to the bone. So it's continuous with this epimysium, so it is connective tissue layer that it will allow us to connect the bone and the muscle with a great amount of strength. Okay. Nerves and blood vessels. Again, each skeletal muscle is supplied by one nerve, one artery, and one or more veins. A nerve's job, again, can allow the muscle to be excited. It can also provide the brain with some feedback in terms of proprioception. So it can allow us to understand our body's sense of location. So the relationship in terms of joint angles. It can also provide us with information about pain that we might be feeling, heat within the muscles. So we have all sorts of receptors within the muscles that will send signals up the nerve to tell the brain what's going on in the muscle. Arteries are going to provide the muscle with oxygen and nutrients, which will be important for us in terms of providing us with energy that we need in the muscle to allow contractions to occur. And then the veins are going to carry away waste products, and the veins' job will be to take blood from the muscle back to the heart. So all 3, so the nerve, artery, and vein, enter and exit the muscle near the middle of its length, so kind of near the muscle belly itself. The density of the capillaries within the muscle varies based on the amount of work regularly being done by that particular muscle. Okay, so capillaries' job is to facilitate exchange. Okay, so the artery brings the blood to the muscle. Capillary will facilitate exchange at the muscle, and the amount of capillaries that you have in any particular area is based on your training status, basically. So, for example, if I am a biker and I really enjoy biking and I do it all the time, you know that I'm going to require a lot of work to be done in my leg muscles. So in my leg muscles, I might have a high density of capillaries within that particular area. And the reason that this is a benefit to me would be that it would allow me to more quickly deliver oxygen and nutrients while I'm doing that particular exercise bout. And it is another awesome thing about this is it's very specific to the muscles that you use. So again, for example, if I am a biker, I might have a high amount of capillaries within my legs, but maybe not so much in my upper body and my arms because I'm not necessarily using those particular areas as much. So in order for a muscle to cause movement, it must cross at least one movable joint, and a muscle contraction causes the movement of the bone while another bone stays relatively stationary. Okay, So we have what's called an origin and an insertion of the muscle. The origin is the attachment of the muscle that's less movable. Okay. So this is generally the more proximal location. So it's generally located closer to the midline of your body. Not always the case, but usually that's the case. And the insertion is the movable point of attachment of the bone. Okay, and again, this is generally a more distal point of attachment. And in lab, this semester, we'll be learning about all the origin and insertions of many of our major muscles within the body. So more to come on that. Okay, a couple other terms that are important for us to understand, particularly as we move forward and get into the labs and start learning the different muscle names and actions and things, are uniarticular and biarticular. Uni means one, bi means two. A uniarticular muscle crosses one joint, and a biarticular muscle will cross two different joints. And why is this important for us to understand? This will help us to understand what the functions of each particular muscle is. So a muscle that is uniarticular in nature will only act upon one joint, whereas a muscle that's biarticular or crosses two joints will have movements at both joints. So, for example, your rectus femoris is a muscle that attaches onto your hip and then will attach onto the patella tendon. So it crosses both the hip joint and the knee joint. And so it's biarticular in nature, and it has two major movements. It can allow for flexion at the hip and extension at the knee. And again, it's important for us to recognize that it's biarticular because now we know that we have two different types of movement going on. Okay, in terms of the microscopic view of the muscle, again, in this class, we'll just be focusing on the structural components, and then in the second semester of this class, we'll be talking about the functional components. So let's take a look at what's going on here. So this is one individual muscle cell here, and it's made up of myofibrils. And myofibrils are a protein-like bundle of contractile proteins, basically. So it's a protein-like bundle of contractile elements. Okay. So all of these are myofibrils. They're basically just like proteins in there. And they're going to allow us to have shortening or contraction of the muscle. We also have sarcomere, and the sarcomere is our basic unit of muscle contraction. And these are repeating segments within the myofibril. So this is a sarcomere, this is a sarcomere, this is a sarcomere, and so on. So every time the muscle contracts, the sarcomere itself will shorten. Okay. Again, under a microscope, this is what the sarcomere looks like, and it is made up of the overlapping of two types of filaments. We have a thick filament, you can see here in the blue, and a thin filament, which you can see here in the red. Also known as, the thick filament is also known as myosin, and the thin filament is known as actin. Okay. The overlapping of these two filaments is what creates those striations that we can see within the skeletal muscle. I'm less concerned with us memorizing the Z line, A band, I band, all that sort of thing. Just know what the sarcomere is, and then know the filaments, the thin and thick filaments. Okay, sarcomere here. Thick filaments, again, are those myosins that we just saw. Thick strand with globular heads that protrude out, and these form cross bridges. So the myosin heads are going to, in order for muscle contraction to occur, are going to connect to the actin molecule, which is our thin filament, and the latching on of the myosin to the actin is what actually allows us to produce force. Okay, so our thin filament, which is actin, is a thin strand that has binding sites on it, and this thin strand also contains two other protein components called troponin and tropomyosin. Troponin is like a small molecule that allows for the binding of calcium, and tropomyosin is like a strand-like um, protein that covers up the binding sites on the actin molecule. Okay, so here you can see actin is here, myosin in the middle. Again, you can see all the cross bridges that are located on the myosin filaments. And in order for muscle contraction to occur, each of these myosin heads will connect to the actin molecule, and their connection to each other is what, again, allows us to produce a force. Okay. Again, looking more detailed about what the thick filament contains. So it's basically made of two protein strands that are twisted together, and one end of the strand is folded together to form this globular head. And the globular heads, again, are going to project from the thick filament and have their interaction with the actin strands. And again, that's what allows us to produce muscle contraction. Our thin filaments, again, we said were composed of three types of proteins. We have actin, troponin, and tropomyosin. And we have active sites that are located on the actin molecule. The active sites located on the actin molecule are where the myosin heads can actually bind to. So the actin forms like the backbone of the filament, and individual or globular actin molecules are joined together to form a strand. It's basically like a strand of beads, is what I picture in my mind. Tropomyosin is like a little yarn, I imagine, and that's a tube-shaped protein that twists around the actin. And the job of tropomyosin is to cover the actin binding site so that there isn't any interaction between the actin and myosin unless we want there to be. Okay, so tropomyosin covers up the actin binding sites when we're at rest. Troponin is the smallest of the proteins, and this acts as a binding site for calcium. Okay, so troponin is just a small little receptor protein molecule located on this thin filament. And basically, in order for muscle contraction to occur, calcium comes, binds to troponin, and this causes troponin to tell tropomyosin to move out of the way and uncovers the actin binding sites, and then actin and myosin have their interaction. Here's a beautiful picture that shows you kind of the molecular details of what the thin filament looks like. So again, you've got actin, which will form like the backbone of this strand. Troponin, again, like we said, would serve as a binding site for calcium, and then tropomyosin is this thin strand that covers the actin binding sites while we're at rest. Okay, so let's move on and let's talk about the details and some other structures within the muscle itself. Okay, so sarcolemma is known as the cell membrane. Okay, so the sarcolemma surrounds the entire muscle cell or the muscle fiber itself. This is the same thing as the endomysium that we mentioned earlier. It's a connective tissue outer lining that covers the entire cell. We also have a sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is located here in the blue. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is an intercellular highway. Its job, it stores calcium, and it's the same if you remember back to like high school biology or anything else. It's the same thing as endoplasmic reticulum, with the exception of the only difference is it's located in a muscle. So I don't know why we need multiple names for things, but sarcoplasmic reticulum is just a fancy word for endoplasmic reticulum, but it's specific to the muscle itself. And we also have T-tubules, which you can see here. And these T-tubules are invaginations of the cell membrane. And the job of the T-tubules is to allow us to excite the whole cell much more rapidly. So it will allow us to send an excitatory signal all the way to the interior of the cell. Okay, we have what's called a triad. Again, tri means three, so we know that this involves three components. And this includes the terminal cistern of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's located on either sides of the T-tubule. Okay, so the terminal cistern is the portion of the endoplasmic reticulum that's the closest to the T-tubules. And the job of the terminal cistern is to store large quantities of calcium. And the triad, again, is composed of two terminal cisterns, again, one on either side, and also one T-tubule, or transverse tubule. It's the same thing. T-tubule and transverse tubule are the same words. Okay, so that's the triad. I guess in terms of understanding the function of this system, as we excite a muscle, we're going to send a signal down the T-tubules, and it's going to quickly cause the release of calcium from within the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's what allows us to stimulate muscle contraction. And again, that's something that we'll cover in greater detail in the second semester of this course. So in terms of the mechanism of muscle contraction, in order to produce movement, muscles must shorten or lengthen. So we have a concentric contraction. We also have eccentric contraction. So concentric contraction involves the muscle shortening, and the shortening allows us to produce a force. Eccentric contraction involves muscle lengthening as it generates force, and this involves a controlled movement or resistance due to gravity. So in terms of the sliding filament theory, this has to do with how the muscles can shorten. So myosin heads attach and detach to the actin thin filaments, pulling the thin filaments towards the center of the sarcomere. Neither actin nor myosin actually change their length during muscle shortening. They only overlap to a greater extent. I've got two different YouTube videos here that can kind of show you in a little bit better, probably a little bit better than I can explain, how this actual muscle shortening can occur. So how do muscles stretch? Skeletal muscle is stretched when a muscle with the opposite movement can contract. Or we can also stretch a muscle by moving the opposite direction of its given action. So we said that extensible is one of the four unique characteristics of a muscle. How exactly do they stretch? Again, we'll spend some time in lab talking about how we can specifically stretch each type of muscle, but basically, if you know what the joint action of a muscle is, if you do the opposite of that, you should be able to stretch that particular muscle. A couple other components that we should define is the innervation of a skeletal muscle. What is innervation? Innervation basically just means that who is in charge of telling the muscle to contract, or who is in charge of telling the muscle what to do. A nerve innervator, a particular nerve, is going to innervate each individual muscle. So no muscle has more than one innervation for the most part. So innervation just basically tells us the name of the nerve that's in charge of stimulating that particular muscle. A motor neuron is a neuron or a nerve cell that's in charge of stimulating a bunch of muscle cells. So a motor neuron is the neuron in charge of stimulating the particular skeletal muscle. Neuromuscular junction is the junction between the neuron and the muscle cell itself. They don't actually touch each other. There's a small gap between the two. A motor unit is the motor neuron and all of the cells that it innervates. Okay, so a motor unit is the motor neuron and the number of cells that it innervates. So, for example, one motor neuron can be in charge of a lot of different muscle cells, but each individual muscle cell can only have one boss. Okay, so one boss may have multiple employees, but all of the employees can only have one boss. They only are in one job. Okay, so that's the motor unit. Recruitment. In order to create a large amount of force, we may need to recruit motor units. Think about this in terms of recruitment for sports. Some of you were recruited to play a particular sport here at Loras College. So recruitment means we need to go out and get more, pretty much. So in order for us to create a large amount of force, we need to get more motor units involved in this particular activity. Types of skeletal muscle fibers. Skeletal muscle fibers are categorized by two different ways. The first is how much ATP or energy they can make, and the second is how quickly they can contract. Okay, so let me repeat that. Number one, how much ATP or energy they can make, and number two, how quickly can they contract. And these two things are usually very closely related. So if you can contract very quickly, usually you can't produce a large amount of ATP. If you contract pretty slowly, you're going to have a larger amount of endurance and therefore last a lot longer. So of the muscle fiber types, and I'm sure you've heard of fast twitch and slow twitch fibers before, all of our muscles actually contain a combination of single skeletal muscle cells that have differing shortening speeds and strength capacities. So we have type 1, type 2A, and type 2X fibers that are dispersed throughout the entire muscle. So one single motor unit is made up of one single type of muscle fibers. So each muscle itself has many motor units. You might have one type 1 motor unit. You might have another that's a type 2A motor unit. You might have 3 that are type 2X motor units. Again, it can vary from muscle to muscle and from person to person as well. So what determines what type of muscle fiber we have? This is pretty much genetic. So you can tell your parents thank you if you've been blessed with good genetics in terms of your muscle fiber types. Again, almost purely genetic in nature. There's not much we can do to change the muscle fiber types that you have. That being said, certain muscle fiber compositions will make you more likely to be successful in particular types of sports. So for example, if you have a large amount of slow twitch or type 1 fibers, you're more likely to be successful at endurance types of sports. So cross country, endurance running, endurance swimming, maybe soccer. So those are some of the sports where endurance is important for you. So that might make you more successful in those particular sports. Maybe you have a high concentration of type 2 fibers. So you're more likely to be successful in sports that require a high amount of power, like football or baseball or softball. Those are all examples of sports that are going to require a high amount of power, but it's okay if you get fatigued pretty quickly because we're going to have a lot of starts and stops within those particular sports. Let's talk in just a little more detail about these different fiber types. Slow oxidative or type 1 fibers are also called slow twitch fibers, and they're thin red fibers. They're red in nature because they require oxygen. They have an abundant amount of myoglobin, and myoglobin is the oxygen carrying compound that's located within the cell. So the job of myoglobin is to carry oxygen from the cell's edge to the cell mitochondria. And once we deliver that oxygen to the cell mitochondria, we can utilize it in order for us to produce energy. Slow oxidative fibers are also going to have a rich supply of capillaries. And again, this is important for us because these types of fibers absolutely need oxygen in order for them to complete whatever their particular action is. And they're also going to be extremely fatigue resistant if oxygen is available. So they don't produce a high amount of power, but they can produce a large amount of endurance. So therefore they can last for an extended period of time as long as they have oxygen available. Okay. We also have fast glycolytic fibers, and these are known as type 2X fibers, also called fast twitch fibers. These are more pale in nature and not quite as red as our type 1 fibers. They contain very little myoglobin, so oxygen is not important for them because they're primarily going to be anaerobic in nature. They also have a larger diameter than the slow oxidative fibers, and that's because they're going to be able to produce a larger amount of force than those slow oxidative fibers will. Okay. We also have what's called fast oxidative fibers or type 2A fibers. These are intermediate fibers, so they're kind of like in between in terms of their fatigability, their amount of oxygen that they can utilize, also, the speed at which they function. They're kind of like right in the middle between your other two extremes. And these fibers, interestingly enough, are trainable. So we can't determine which types of fibers that we have, but we can take these fast oxidative fibers and train them in a particular way. So for example, let's say I wanted to be really good at football. I can train my type 2A fibers to be much like my type 2X fibers. So I can train them to be highly powerful and to produce a high amount of force in a quick amount of time. Okay. On the contrary, let's say I decide I want to run a marathon. I can train these fast oxidative fibers to be more like my slow twitch fibers. So they will rely heavily on oxygen. They will rely heavily on a low amount of power, but yet they can sustain a contraction for an extended period of time. They can improve their level of endurance. So these fibers are good for us in terms of giving us the capability of training for what it is that we would like to train for. This is a nice summary chart for you in terms of classifying your 3 different fiber types based on, several different components. So let's go through this chart here. So first, nerve conduction velocity. So how quickly can the nerve cause stimulation of this particular type of muscle fiber? So with our type 2X, this is very fast. We can very quickly cause a contraction of the muscle fiber. And this makes sense if you think about a reaction of somebody who is highly trained with these fast twitch fibers. So for example, for a 100-meter dash, being able to respond very quickly to hearing the gun go off is very, very important for athletes in terms of being successful in that particular race. So nerve conduction velocity has to be very, very fast in order for that athlete to get out of their blocks very quickly. Again, with slow oxidative fibers, not as important. Things are going to be moving a little bit slower with those particular types of fibers and their velocity. Motor unit size. Our largest motor units, and again, a motor unit involves the motor neuron and all the cells that it innervates. The largest motor units that we have are our fast glycolytic fibers. And this makes sense too. If you think about wanting to produce a high amount of power and you want to do things quickly, we need to activate a large amount of muscle mass. So having a large motor unit is very important for us in terms of producing a large amount of force. Type 1 fibers, however, are going to have smaller motor units. Most of, well, I don't want to say most of, some of our type 1 or our slow oxidative fibers are going to be important for fine-tuned movements. So, like the movements needed with the dexterity you need to be able to paint a picture or to, color in some lines very detailed. We don't need a large amount of force, we just need a large amount of accuracy. So that might be more important for these slow oxidative fibers. Speed of contraction, again, that's kind of the basis for the names of these types of fibers. So fast oxidative is kind of in the middle. Fast glycolytic will contract very quickly, and again, that will allow us to quickly get out of the blocks in that 100-meter dash and be successful there. Our slow oxidative fibers are going to be much more slow with their contraction speed. Amount of mitochondria. Mitochondria is the location where we produce aerobic energy within the cell, and so it would be really important for our slow oxidative fibers to have a high amount of mitochondria because that's how they're going to produce energy. So again, that will be highest within the type 1 or our slow oxidative fibers. Fatigue resistance, again, very low with our type 2X fibers. They can produce a high amount of force very quickly, but they're going to get tired pretty quickly as well. Slow oxidative can't produce a high amount of force, but they are fatigue resistant, so they can keep going for an extended period of time. Oxidative capacity, again, this has to do with the ability to use oxygen as a fuel source, or as a fuel mechanism, we could say. And this is going to be highest in our slow oxidative fibers. And glycolytic capacity has to do with non-oxidative metabolism, so using or creating energy without the use of oxygen, and that's going to be highest with our type 2X fibers. So in terms of fiber type and athletic success, individuals who have a large percentage of type 1 fibers would have an advantage in which types of sports. Again, we've kind of already alluded to this. Type 1 fibers would be successful for endurance types of things because they don't produce a lot of force, but yet they can be very fatigue resistant. So people that would like to have a large amount of type 1 fibers would be like marathon runners, your cross-country runners, long distance swimmers, our soccer players would like to have a large amount of type 1 fibers, etc. Individuals who have a large percentage of type 2 fibers would have an advantage in which types of sports. Again, any sport that would rely or would require a high amount of power and a short amount of time. So examples would be football, throwing the shot put, because it's one quick burst of energy. What else? Baseball is another example. Softball also. So you need to create a high amount of power, but yet you get an extended period of rest time to recover. This is nothing by any means that you need to memorize. I just think this is interesting in terms of comparing our slow twitch and fast twitch fiber composition within some elite athletes. So you can see with the marathon runners here, about 85% of their muscle fibers are slow twitch and only about 15% are fast twitch. Whereas if you look at the other end of the spectrum with our sprinters, elite sprinters would have about 80% fast twitch and 20% slow twitch. The average population is about 50-50 if you look there in the middle. But again, the good news is that we can train some of those those fast oxidative fibers. We can train those to be like, what we want to be successful at. Just a couple things in relation to disorders of the skeletal muscle tissue. Muscular dystrophy is a genetic muscle destroying disease that appears in childhood. And muscle fibers degenerate and fill with fat and connective tissue. Individuals are usually diagnosed between the age of 2 and 10 years old, and unfortunately, the victims rarely live past the age of 20 years old. Okay. Another disorder of the skeletal muscle tissue is fibromyalgia. This is chronic pain syndrome with an unknown cause, and symptoms are severe musculoskeletal pain, fatigue, sleep abnormalities, and headache. Common sites are in the lower back and neck. Lower back pain is actually the number one reason people miss work in America. So, probably a lot of people have this issue and maybe are undiagnosed. Treatments include antidepressants, exercise, and pain relievers to help us to alleviate some of this chronic pain.